welcome to part 2 of our 4-part series on socio-ecological ethics, designed by Dr. John Hart, Professor of Christian Ethics. Earlier, Dr. Hart discussed the scriptural basis for relationship, and now he'll return and bring our attention to focus on spiritual and the social basis for relationship. Dr. Hart will lecture, followed by a time of question and answer. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for your patience. Dr. Hart.
Welcome to part 2, talking about socio-ecological ethics. Again, it's the integration of social justice in and among human communities with ecological well-being for Earth and all living beings. It's a 4-webinar series, as was mentioned, and we're on part 2, spiritual and social bases for relationship. In Christian traditions, Earth is viewed as a sacramental commons. In special moments, the commons is a place of human engagement with the Spirit. Church rituals and church buildings provide ecclesial sacraments. Earth provides natural sacraments. So we'll be looking at experiencing the Creator through creation, that the creation itself becomes sacramental, exterior to official rituals in church buildings. In the Christian tradition, Earth is viewed as a sacramental commons, a place that provides, or at least is intended by the Spirit to provide, the necessities of life and well-being for all biota who are to live as a sharing community oriented toward the common good. So looking at how does the good of everybody become integrated, how does what we do work well with, adapt to, and adapt from our Earth environment. In religious traditions more generally, Earth is understood to be a sacred commons, the biotic community common ground which provides natural goods for all life to share and is presenced by the immanent transcendent Spirit. I use the term natural goods instead of resources. A resource implies something that's is waiting to be extracted. So it could be diverting a river to a different purpose, removing minerals, removing forests, whatever it might be, instead of them staying where they were, which they might have been in a place where they're doing very well in terms of providing not only for human needs, but for the needs of birds and animals and so forth. So it's, I think natural goods is a better way of phrasing it. It's something that's naturally existing on Earth that people can, as do other creatures, take from to provide for their needs. People are familiar with St. Francis and his work on ecology. Pope John Paul II named him the patron saint of ecology, a suggestion made quite some time earlier by Lynn White Jr. in his essay, The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. So he is well known for his work on ecology, but he also had a special concern for and compassion toward the least of these, the poorest of the poor. That phrase, of course, is from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 25, Last Judgment Story. The Son of Humanity, the great judge, evaluates the conduct of the people gathered before him on the basis of how they have become involved very practically in terms of providing for the needs of those who are most in need in our society, those who are oppressed, those who are harmed in one way or the other. And the sole criterion to enter into the reign of God will be to what extent people have provided for the needs of the suffering others who are calling to them, and among whom the Son of Humanity is calling also. There's nothing about prayers, temples, rituals, and so forth. It's all what you've done external to these official kind of religious actions. A just distribution of Earth's natural goods would have enabled all people to satisfy their basic needs for food, clothing, shelter, and compassionate love. Excuse me. Francis took care of lepers, the most rejected of outcasts. He established shelters for them and fed them. So he did have this compassion for the poor. Francis was known when he was a youth. He was had a wonderful time with his drinking buddies and so forth, and he was always afraid of, apparently he's a pretty good-looking guy, afraid of not looking as good physically, and he always used to shy away from lepers. The sentiment at the time was that you could catch leprosy just by being near lepers. And a telling conversion on his part was one time later, after he became much more focused on caring for others, He was riding on his horse and he saw a leper, and instead of galloping around him, he jumped off his horse and embraced the leper and kissed him, called him brother, and then that's what gave him the idea of starting to have a shelter for lepers. They were kind of wandering around the forest and people didn't really want to take care of him. So a particular ministry of the brothers that he founded, the friars minor, the lesser brothers, was to take care of lepers, provide them food, wash their sores and bandage them and so forth. Of course, he is well known for his liking for, association with, sense of kinship with all creatures, whom we call brother and sister. And his Canticle of All Creatures expresses this well. And this is, it's worth taking a little bit of time for, because we can see a couple of things that are present in here. So most high, all powerful, and all good Lord, praise, glory, honor, and all blessing are yours. This, by the way, is a translation that I made from the Assisi manuscript in Italy, in Assisi. To you alone, most high, they belong, although no one is worthy to say your name. And notice now the kinship, the relationship, that familial bonding that takes place here. Praise be, my Lord, with all your creatures, especially my Lord, brother, son, through whom you give us day and night and light. Beautifully he shines with great splendor. Most high he bears your likeness. Praise be, my Lord, by sister moon and stars. In the heavens you made them bright and precious and beautiful. So these things that would, notice how it's praise be God by these. Some of the earliest translators or biographers of Francis saw him as meaning this literally, that these creatures were praising God. They're not being praised just by being part of creation and people are admiring them for how they show God's creativity and so forth, but rather they themselves have kind of this life and they are expressing this praise on their own, including the sun and the moon, which we would, most people would regard as lifeless. And you'll notice how it begins with the heavens and then gradually works down to earth and the elements here. Praise be, my Lord, by brother wind and air and cloud and calm and all weather, through which you sustain your creatures. Praise be, my Lord, by his sister water, who is so helpful and humble and precious and pure. Praise be, my Lord, by brother fire, through whom you brighten the night, who is beautiful and playful and sinuous and strong. Been to a fireplace, seen a fireplace, think of a fire, even a bonfire, how it flows. Praise be, my Lord, by our sister, Mother Earth. And these are Francis' words. Earth is both sister and mother, who sustains us and guides us and provides varied fruits with colorful flowers and herbs. Praised and blessed be you, my Lord, and gratitude and service be given to you with great humility. So a sense that all creatures are praising God. And what might have been noticeable about that, several things. One is that people are familiar with, again, the statues and the pictures and so forth of Francis. He's usually accompanied by birds. He is spoken of as having preached to the birds, with a wolf near a town called Agobio that was kind of marauding, and Francis went out in the forest and met it and convinced it to do otherwise. Fish. One time a fish, when he was out in the boat, leaped into his arms and he held it and then put it back in the water, and so forth. If you think about this poem, and you think of all these kind of pictures and statues, Francis at bird fountains with birds on his shoulders and the wolf next to him, a variety of ways in which he's pictured with other kinds of animals and birds, there is no living being in his poem. And it might strike you, if you think about it, wait a second, this is Francis who loves all creatures and calls all creatures brother and sister. How come in his poem, his song, which celebrates this, there is nothing mentioned about these other kinds of lives that he was related to and familiar with? And the answer is in the composition of the canticle itself. The canticle, of course, is song. What Francis did was, much like contemporary songwriters might do, especially folk singers, where they come up with a melody, they come up with words they want to talk about something or sing about something, but they set the words to a familiar melody. In some of the early days, and maybe it still happens in churches when they were first beginning to experiment with folk masses and guitars and so forth, well, they might have some very good words from the doctrine and so forth in previous worship, but they didn't quite have all those talents together, some of the earliest writers, so they might be sung to the melody of a familiar Christian song. When Francis was working on the words, on top of a mountain actually, the melody that came to mind was an Italian ballad of his period. And this was a well-known ballad. And it celebrated, again, the birds, the flowers, the deer, a variety of kinds of animals and flowers and their beauty and so forth. Francis would sing this. We don't know the melody any longer, we just know the history of it. And so it's usually when he approached the village, he'd be singing a song, and this was a song that he sang. So the people already knew the melody, so they already know that it's talking about, you know, again, the birds, the flowers, and animals. And then they hear Francis's words are very different. And so having heard so many times the words about all these other kinds of life that are expressed in the song itself, the original song, they would bring that together, link that with Francis's use of the sun, the stars, the moon, and water, and so forth. So his song then does become a very holistic expression of the praise of all creatures. The words from the original melody about living creatures, the words from the song that he wrote talking about the other kinds of creatures. Other interesting things about the poem, the earth, or the sun, is a lord and as well as brother, because the sun was often used as one thing about some people worship the sun as a god. Also, it was also a symbol of Jesus as the light of the world and the sun and so forth. Sister, moon, and stars. Notice how he varies between a brother and sister. So again, this very familial kinship relationship with all other creatures, animate, what we would call living and non-living. Francis might have, like Indians in this country, native peoples of the U.S., might have a sense that even what Westerners, new arrivals, people from Europe and so forth, since the 15th century, what they see as non-living, Indian peoples here would see them as living. That the rocks can speak to you. If you listen, you hear the voice of the rocks or the water and so forth. So when Francis calls them brother and sister, he's making a similar kind or parallel kind of observation. The Psalms talk about even the very rocks will cry out when the Messiah comes. So you have that kind of integration of living and non-living that are taking place here. So again, this is what socio-ecological praxis ethics is about. It's socio-ecological. It's about social justice in human communities and the ecological well-being of Earth and of all of the biotic community, which is the community of all life. And they are very much integrated. If you look at issues today, issues of pollution, of droughts where water is disappearing and farmers are having a hard time, fires and so forth, we can see how human activity is very much impacting the other creatures. And it makes it hard for people to even make their living today. Farmers again in the Midwest or in California, other areas of the world, in Africa and so forth. And then in contrast, you have very severe cold weather, such as we're having in Boston at the moment. We went through our second blizzard a few days ago, and maybe there are more on the way. We're setting records for the amount of snowfall in a winter season, and we're only halfway through. So these different kinds of things show how we are very intimately related to the natural world of which we're a part. And what happens when parts of it are harmed, then it means that in terms of the broader social well-being, the poor especially are most impacted by what happens with things like climate change or flooding, which most people in the world live along some kind of body of water, and as the waters rise because of the melting of the ice, then their farms are inundated, their homes are inundated, peoples around the world already, islands are disappearing, and where people have lived for generations. So everything is very interrelated in a socio-ecological well-being. And the praxis ethics means in place, that is in the context where these events are happening, whether it's in a community, whether it's a leper walking along a highway, or a wolf in the forest. All these things are related to us, and we should try to see how we can restore what was undone in the past, and then try to conserve Earth so that in the future then similar situations would not arise. Thank you.
Well, now we'll take any questions those of you who are looking might have for Dr. Hart. Are there any questions? If you have questions, please just put them in the chat area.
Maybe just going back for a bit to an earlier slide, Earth is viewed as a sacramental commons. Notice in the slide, in that first paragraph, it focuses on sacramental. So the phrase is sacramental commons, and the first place we're focusing on the sacramental aspect. So it can be a revelatory of the presence of the Creator within it. For those who come from a tradition that is a sacramental tradition, you might have anywhere from 2 sacraments to 7, be what most traditions would have. Something in that number, and then you understand this notion of sacrament, and you're accustomed to going to a place of worship, which could be a home, it could be a church, a cathedral, a basilica, whatever it might be, to celebrate the sacraments, the church sacraments, which are also called ecclesial sacraments. And they are supposed to be signs of God's grace, of a special relationship with God in that particular moment, in that particular sacrament. Baptism as a sign of being welcomed into the church, a sign of having past sins washed away, and so forth. Symbolism in that. Confirmation, if you have that sacrament, it's kind of a confirmation of your coming into adulthood in life. Matrimony, celebration of the wedding of 2 people, and so on. So we're used to those particular kinds of church sacraments, and really began in the 4th century and earlier, and people started looking at the word sacrament as meaning much more than that. It's not just within buildings that one can encounter God, but also outside, when walking, any kind of activity, hiking and so forth, out in the wilderness, in the forests, or even just along a lake near an urban area. So these moments can also be sacramental, that is, have the experience of the presence of God in those moments. Watching a sunset, you might think of something in your own past where you felt maybe especially a particular presence of divine being away from a church building. It becomes a difficulty when people confine sacraments just to something taking place within a building with a member of the clergy or another kind of representative of a church who is performing or facilitating or overseeing this particular ceremony. King Solomon, way back when he built the temple in Jerusalem, he says at his dedication, and these are words well, there was a contention in Israel at that point. Some people said, well, if we construct a building, then the people will forget that they can worship God wherever they are. God was with us in the wilderness during our wandering. We have different altars set up to God in different places. The danger there was some of the gods weren't the one that they regard as the true God, but they still had this sense of God being wherever they were on earth. So they're afraid that just as other peoples at the time, if you had a building, a place of worship, like a temple, then people would say, okay, it's the Sabbath day, it's time to go worship God, forgetting that it's not just on the Sabbath for a short time that this worship should take place. So when a temple is dedicated, Solomon acknowledges that. The people did not want a temple being built because they thought that would dispel the people's sense of God's presence wherever they were. And his statement at that time is, if the heavens and the highest heavens cannot contain you, how much less this house which I have built, this house of worship which I have built. So he's acknowledging God should not be just confined to a place of worship, but is in the heavens and the highest heavens. It's not just within buildings that humans have made. And God is present in God's building, if you want to call it that, the entire creation. And some people have mentioned that over the course of the years, that there are moments of being closest to God, and you might find this also for yourself, or when they're out in the natural setting, someplace outdoors, by themselves, with friends, family, and so forth. And they don't have to stop and pray only to come to a particular dedicated sacred space. If you think about it, all earth is sacred, all creation is sacred because of the presence of the Creator. So that's the sacramental aspect. And in commons is a place that's supposed to provide for the needs of all who are living in it. And sometimes just among the human community, human family, you can see how people hoard for themselves various aspects, various elements, various natural goods, not because they need them, but because they want more and more and so forth. And therefore, sometimes when they do this, it's at the benefit, at the cost to other peoples. The Wall Street Journal a few years ago had an article about water as the blue golds for the 21st century, telling people to invest in water. There have been efforts to privatize water and actual places around the world where this was done. And it means the very poorest of the poor, they can't just, they're going to run out of money on the card they give them in order to try to access water in different places. And so the United Nations, the Catholic bishops, the Vatican, World Council of Churches, other religious leaders and bodies said that water is a natural right. It's not something that can be privatized. Everybody has a right to at least the necessities of life, of which water is really the most fundamental. So in commons, nobody should be deprived of that which they need in terms of survival. There's an old story you sometimes hear, give a man a fish, he'll starve tomorrow, he's okay for today. Give a man a fishing pole and he can go out and fish for himself and provide for his food needs. That's really not a very accurate statement in terms of the realities of our society. It's trying to say, well, we shouldn't give welfare, we shouldn't give people food stamps because we should really train them to go out and fend for themselves and pull themselves up by their bootstraps and so forth. But okay, so you have a fishing pole, now where do you go fishing? And do you have access? If you don't have a car, is there some place within walking distance? How are the fish in the lake? Are they stocked? Are they there naturally? What happens if a lot of people go out with fishing poles, first of all competing with each other for space and then trying to get their fishing lines all snagged and so forth as they're all trying to catch a fish and so forth. You know, who has access? We have to go across private property on a path to get to a lake and someone has boarded that off because this is my property and I don't want any trespassers. So it's not as simple as it sounds. You know, initially it sounds, oh, it's a good idea to teach somebody a job and they'll be able to provide for themselves. Well, are there jobs available? Are the lakes available, speaking analogously, and are the fish there and so forth? And what happens if there are droughts and the fish die off? There's a whole bunch of problems there. So we have to do both, actually, in a commons. The person is hungry today. Well, if you don't give them that fish today, then maybe they're going to starve before they get a chance to get to the lake with their fishing pole to go fishing. So they need food today, and for every today that food is a necessity, people have a right to food. Then also give them the fishing pole, but maybe the job training, also a good place to live, not in a slum and so on. Give them the basic necessities of life. In the richest country in the world, people should at least be able to have the necessities of life and a place to live and health care and so forth. So the commons means we take from this shared wealth of natural goods what we need, but we also are sharing that with other people. And if they can't make it themselves, can't get to the place themselves, get their food, then we take it to them. There's a number of church groups and other kinds of groups too. So commons, keeping that in mind, it's for everybody. That's why it's a commons. And people should be hoarding parts of it, especially very important parts of it, for themselves. In his novel Utopia, Thomas More wrote centuries ago, this particular character in the novel comes from visiting a faraway place and how the people there are all happy and so on. And this person, Raphael, gives him descriptions of how the governance goes and what happens there. And in the course of commenting on that and affirming that, Francis mentions that today sheep are devouring people. Today in England, sheep are devouring people. The illusion he had was, that's what illusion he has as to what happened is that for centuries, farmers in England had been using lands from a very large landholder, a very large estate, and it was unused in terms of the Lord of the Manor's manor was concerned. And so for generations, people would grow food, they give a percentage of it, either in food itself or if they bartered for something to the person whose land it was. There were also lands they shared in common which were not part of an estate owned by a duke or whomever. And so people found out that they could, those who had a lot of money, that they could make more money selling wool than by selling crops or by having farmers on their land. So they passed what we call enclosure acts, and all these farmers, these thousands of farmers and their families were pushed off the lands and were forced to go to cities, where of course they didn't have the skills to get jobs, and a great poverty resulted. And but the wealthy got wealthier, and Thomas More laments that. That's why what he means by the sheep are devouring the people. That this desire for having the sheep spread out all over the Lord's estate meant that there was no room for farmers to grow their crops and be able to make the kind of living they had made for centuries. So that's an example of what was once operated as a commons, and everybody was happy. The lords were basically doing nothing and getting paid for it because of all the renters on their land, and the people were happy. They had a livelihood, different kinds of crafts, and so on. And now all of a sudden they lose that. They lose their sense of respect, of having a place and a job, and so forth. To try to stop the theft by all these landless agricultural communities in the urban areas, the officials, as an example, hung a lot of them. And Thomas More talks about at one time when over 1,000 men were hung. And he said, that's not going to do anything, because if people are hungry, hanging some of them is not going to make them stop being hungry. They need food, they need a job, they need to have their lands back, and so on. So when you have a commons, you have this attitude of looking out for the well-being of everybody, and not only your own well-being, but kind of building on that and having much more than you actually need, whereas other peoples are suffering from need. Gandhi once said famously, "There's enough on earth to satisfy everyone's need, but not everyone's greed." That it's a problem of distribution, who is hoarding things for themselves rather than attempt to distribute it well to all the citizens of the society. All the citizens of the society.
Thank you. Well, I think we've come to the end. We appreciate you. We hope you all will join us again for part 3 of the webinar series on February the 24th, I believe that is. And once again, it is February 24th at 1 p.m. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.